Okay, so you've qualified a deal. All the right stakeholders have agreed that this is what they need to purchase. They've confirmed you're the vendor of choice. They've confirmed that there's budget. They've confirmed your T's and C's. They love you. But now you've got to deal with procurement. In my experience, so many opportunities fall down when it gets to the salesperson dealing with procurement. We're going to tackle that today and educate you guys on what procurement look out for when they're dealing with salespeople, the do's and the don'ts. To do this, we're leaning on a special guest. Ngaire Guzzetti has spent the last decade working in procurement departments and now works for the multinational insurance company Allianz. She's going to share some tips on how salespeople can collaborate with procurement departments to ultimately get the best outcomes. Before we jump into this interview, don't forget to subscribe, hit that bell notification so you can continue to get great content like this. Cool, well look, we're joined by a very special guest. We're joined by Ngaire, who spent over a decade working in procurement departments and now works for the multinational corporate, a brand that you all would have heard of, Allianz Insurance. Ngaire, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. Very excited.
Well, look, this is going to be an interesting chat, right? Because you're going to have all eyes on you. All the salespeople over the years that procurement departments have scuppered their deals or negotiated away their comm structures. I'm only joking. There's a perception in sales sometimes that we're battling against procurement, which I think is a really bad way of looking at it from the offset, right? What I'd love to understand from you is what's the best way for salespeople to collaborate with procurement to ultimately mean that both parties get what they want from the engagement or the transaction?
I mean, it's a great question, and one that I'm very passionate about. Mutual benefits for both parties. Obviously, it doesn't work with low-level transactional procurement. So if you're doing stationery or something, unless it's a big contract, you probably wouldn't want to spend too much time on it, and it does depend on the goods or services that you're procuring. But certainly, I'm very much a proponent of mutual benefits, mutual gains for both parties, should we say? So when you're going through a tender or when you're trying to negotiate, definitely be honest and open. It's not for everyone, and obviously I can only attest for my own views. I'm sure that there's a lot of procurement professionals that would love to be in my position right now and to be able to have this conversation. But I'm very much a proponent of open book costing. Show us what your costs are, so that we can understand why you might have a slightly higher price than a different vendor. Sharing incentives, it's not all about cost. Is there any training that we could combine on? Is there something that we can do that we do as a company? For example, we've got a fantastic whistleblowing helpline. Does your company have that? Is that something that we could offer to your staff? Even things like sustainability practices. Can we have a look together at how we can make an impact on anything ESG related? It's another one of my big passions. So yeah, I think. Long story short would be open honesty.
It's interesting you mentioned about the costings there. So you're obviously a fan of when someone's selling a product or selling a service, you want to really scrutinise what the costing is and how that organisation comes about that price point. So is that about internal justification, or is that about when looking at different suppliers?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably a bit of both. So obviously cost isn't everything in a negotiation, and actually my preference would always be to go for a BAFO, to be best or final offer, so that you don't actually have to waste time on the negotiation of that side of things. For me, that it's if you're putting a weighting on a scoring on a cost during a tender process, if you're then aiming to then negotiate that cost down, what's the point in having the weighting? It seems like it makes it a bit moot if you then go, oh, actually that doesn't actually mean anything. And how is that fair on the other suppliers who bid higher or lower with that in mind? So it just yeah, I definitely don't think cost is everything, but I would expect to have anything broken down. Again, just my preference, to have everything broken down so that we can see where you're coming from, and that we don't try and we know that you've got to make a profit. You're not in it for the love, same as we're not. But I think in terms of building a good trust and a good relationship, which is ultimately where you want to be, that's what I would recommend.
Now, there's a perception within sales that the ultimate goal of the procurement department is to drive down cost, right?
Yeah.
So that often means that there's an expectation that there's going to be a negotiation process.
Of course.
What I'm interested to learn is what are the KPIs that are motivating procurement departments? What are you guys actually judged on? What does success in your role look like?
Gosh, I think price is literally just one small element of it. We at Allianz at the moment have a huge focus on sustainability. We're obviously cost does have quite a big impact. We need to make sure that we have the budget, and with even though we're a big multinational corporation, we obviously still have to make sure that we're hitting the bottom line and hitting our savings targets. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to look at cost as the only value activity. We could also look at what extras are you providing? Are you providing additional training? Could we collaborate on that? Anything to do with anything additional that could add value. So we go through due diligence processes. We obviously go through. We've got a set. We've got set questions for the standard tender process, and that does include things like which countries are you operating in? Are you paying people the living wage? So we've got a corporate social responsibility as well as ethical responsibilities. So yeah, adding value in other ways I think is quite key. Even things like what are the SLAs that you're offering us? Is your service desk going to respond within 2 hours, or are they going to respond within 24? That could be quite key if it's a critical system for us. If it goes down and that affects our end customers, that's an absolute no for us. Certainly within the insurance business, anyway.
So that's interesting. So there's negotiables outside of cost, and you're looking at things like value adds. So I'm guessing things like inventory, like you say, like service level agreements, that sort of stuff can be enough to actually demonstrate value to a procurement department to ultimately make that decision.
Absolutely, and even things like we have set things that we have to have in the contract. We've got the must, we've got the intend, and we've got the like to have. The good old mill. We still work on that, but we do obviously. If you refuse to sign up to something like our vendor code of conduct, that's an absolute. That's our walk away point. We have no choice.
So a question that jumps out to me, and you kind of touched on these parts already, but it'd be really good to get a deeper understanding of this. Is that I look at this from the salesperson point of view. They've invested loads of time in pitching to the right people. They've found out a business case. They've built a business case. It goes through and everyone goes, great, we're now going to buy it. And then it gets through to procurement. And there's an understanding or a perception that there is going to be a bit of back and forth. And sometimes it's like, we won't even talk to you. We only want to deal with you over email, which is quite common actually with procurement departments. Mm. What could a salesperson do from minute one to go, this is going to help you get this deal over the line?
Well, I think to begin with, a sales pitch is one thing, but most companies will have rules around what the thresholds are for going to tender. So just because you've got the most amazing product on the market, and we can see that quite often, we can say, we know that this is going to be, but because of the internal process, because of everything that we have to go through and we have to do due diligence, you are forced to go down the tender route. So don't just kind of think, oh, they're just doing it for red tape. It's not. It's because it is, we do need to make sure that we are getting the best value from the market. So I think in terms of what can you do is patience, like everybody. Everybody's overworked, underpaid. We have possibly multiple tenders going on at the same time, so it won't always be our focus.
What are the absolute no-nos? What are the things where you're like, we're just not dealing with you now because you've done this, this and this? What are those no-nos?
I think probably for me personally, the pushiness. It's not just within a business perspective, but certainly I've been to Marrakesh, I've been to the Sikhs, and it's too much for me. If your product is fantastic, you shouldn't have to try too hard to pitch or your services. So yeah, I think being pushy and not giving us time to digest what you've got, and certainly in terms of the timescales of the tender as well, we have to do certain things, and it might be frustrating, but yeah, unfortunately it is the process. And so and there is reasons behind it, which I think maybe we don't often necessarily communicate very effectively, of why things can sometimes take a long time. So maybe that's a fault of procurement. We need to be more open and honest about what the process is and why the process is like that.
I think salespeople often just try and align the product to the problem, whereas a lot of what you're saying is actually aligning the business's values as well. So the stuff you're saying around fair trade and around not using modern slavery and There needs to be a synergy of values as well as just the product solves the problem. What's the sort of scales of that, would you say? What's the weighting of that?
Gosh, I think going forward into the future, I think across most industries, you will see, my prediction is that you will see much more focus on things like corporate social responsibility and making environmental impact, end consumers care, and their recognition of that is growing and growing and growing. For example, I would never buy from certain clothing brands that I know have been only accused at this stage of using modern slaves in the Leicester factories. And so, we've got to be aware of our supply chains, and if there is any risk that could cause reputational damage to the company, that's obviously not going to align with our corporate strategy, with our corporate aims and goals. We certainly have a huge focus on sustainability, as I mentioned before. So anything that a supplier is doing that they can demonstrate that they uphold those values, we're looking towards having commitments from the supplier if that's possible. So there's loads of additional things, but I certainly think the more that you can align with a company's values, the more likely you are to be able to build that relationship and have a long-term working relationship going forward.
Some really interesting stuff came out the back of that interview with Ngaire. One thing jumped out at me straight away is that it's actually important that there is a good fit when it comes to the values of the organisation. What I mean by that is that there needs to be the right profile of business that they're working with that's consistent of the values and the things that organisation really cares about. On top of that, salespeople are not going to want to hear this, but patience is really important. They've obviously got an internal process that they're going through. So helping understand their internal process and helping the procurement department navigate that internal process is really, really important. Clear timelines on both sides is going to help us do that. And lastly, don't be pushy. Nothing worse than a pushy salesperson. Applying the right amount of urgency at the right time with the right people. I hope that was valuable. As always, don't forget to subscribe and like, and happy selling to procurement departments.